So this week, Vladimir Putin, in a speech, said to his Russian people that all of Russia must now prepare for total war. Even if you are not fighting on the front lines in Ukraine, pretend you are. And because of this speech, there are many analysts who believe that Putin is preparing Russia for total war. And total war means that every aspect of your society is geared towards winning a war. And so we last had total war in World War II, okay? But not after that. So why is Putin doing this? Now, there are some people who believe that it's because Russia is not doing so well in Ukraine. They lack manpower, and so they need to mobilize their society to fully win the war in Ukraine. Okay? Another explanation is that Putin knows that NATO is preparing to send reinforcements to Ukraine. Remember that because of last summer's offensive, Ukraine is desperately short of manpower. Okay? The average age of their soldiers right now is over 40. They have men in their 60s who are fighting in the front lines. Emmanuel Macron of France has publicly stated that he is considering sending French troops to Ukraine. The British themselves are thinking of conscription, drafting all young men into the army. The American politicians have said that they're considering a new law that would give citizenship to illegal immigrants who join the army. Okay? So it seems like NATO is only going to escalate the war in Ukraine. And so Russia is preparing for that. One more explanation, one more possibility is that Putin wants to expand the war. Okay? So he knows he's winning in Ukraine, and he's thinking about attacking Moldova and possibly the Baltic states. Okay? These are all possibilities. Today, this morning, what I want to do is argue another possibility, which is that Putin is mobilizing his society because he sees war as a tool, as a mechanism to radically reshape the people in Russia. Okay, so think of a metaphor. Okay, you're fat, and you're like, okay, how do I get fit? How do I get trim, right? You go to the gym, and you work out. And for Putin, that's what war is. War is a workout for your society. When you enter war, you become a much more disciplined, unified, and prosperous society. Okay, so that's what I want to argue today. Okay, so why does Putin think like this? Well, let's look at the current state of Russia. Okay, Russia, in many aspects, is a broken society. Corruption. Russia is the most corrupt society in all of Europe. The rich people steal, and then they run off to Europe or the United States or Dubai. Okay, so corruption is a huge problem in Russia. And because of corruption, the GDP of Russia is very low. So South Korea, which has about a third of the population of Russia, has a higher GDP. Okay? The state of Texas, just one state in the United States, has a higher GDP than Russia. So Russia, in many respects, is a very poor country. Okay? Second problem is alcoholism. 1 out of every 6 Russian males, about 16-17% of the population, they're alcoholics. Okay? It's a disease. They have the disease of alcoholism. 1 out of every 3 deaths in Russia is because of drinking too much. And because of alcoholism, the rate of young men dying is just increasing and increasing, okay? The third problem is fertility. So right now, the fertility rate in Russia is 1.5. That is below the replacement level, right? Remember that the replacement level for society is 2.1. Russia is 1.5. The problem is you have a lot of men dying because of alcoholism, okay? So since the year 2000, the population in Russia has been declining steadily. And all this means is that if current trends continue, then Russia will cease to exist as a society, okay? The nation will die. So why is this happening? Well, okay, the Western explanation is that this is happening because Russia is not democratic, right? If you had full democracy and you unleash the human potential of your people, then Russia will prosper. But Putin, Vladimir Putin, has a different explanation, okay? His explanation is that this is happening in Russia, okay? Corruption, alcoholism, and low fertility, because Russians have been lied to, deceived, and manipulated by Western civilization. Western civilization preaches the gospel of liberal democracy, of freedom, of human rights, of consumerism. And these are all lies. They're hypocrisies that have fooled the Russian people and have corrupted the Russian soul and destroyed Russian civilization. And because Russians are abandoning their soul, their civilization, their nation, this is why this is happening. Okay? Does that make sense? That is Putin's argument. So why does Putin believe this? Well, in the late 80s, the Soviet Union had basically lost the Cold War. And they lost the Cold War because their elite basically gave up. They no longer believed in communism. They didn't believe in self-sacrifice for the nation. They thought that Western values, the Western lifestyle was much better. Okay, so they gave up. In the late 80s, there was an American historian. He actually works for the American State Department. But his name is Francis Fukuyama. And he wrote an extremely influential essay called The End of History. End of history, okay? With a quotation mark. And he argued that the Soviet Union fell and America became triumphant because liberal democracy is the best idea to have ever been invented. And to make his argument, he uses the philosopher Friedrich Hegel, okay? Now, Friedrich Hegel had something called the theory of the dialectic. And what Hegel argued is that history is determined by a war of ideas. The progress of history is determined by the movement of ideas. And how ideas work is that they have a pattern called the dialectic, okay? So there's a thesis, a new idea comes into being. But then we recognize that this idea has problems. It's too extreme. It's too problematic. So we create an antithesis, okay? But this antithesis itself is also too extreme. And this creates also problems. So then what happens is the thesis and the antithesis come together and create a more moderate, more efficient idea, okay, called the synthesis. And this is how history moves or progresses. And so Fukuyama takes this idea and says, okay, well, this explains what's happening today, where at first you have a thesis called capitalism, okay? Capitalism. And this created the Industrial Revolution, right? And because capitalism was too extreme, we moved towards communism, okay? Communism was created to counteract the extremes of capitalism. But communism itself is too extreme, so then we move towards the middle, which is the right idea, which is called liberal democracy. Okay? So what is liberal democracy? Well, at the core of liberal democracy is the idea of consumerism. And the idea of consumerism is that we exist to buy things. And as long as we buy things, there'll be world peace. Why? Because consumers have a need to buy, and therefore nations have a need to produce. And nations produce the best when they're trading together as opposed to warring against each other. Okay? So this is the argument that Francis Fukuyama makes in the end of history. I want to explain this argument further, okay? What's he really saying? Okay, so throughout human history, all societies have struggled with one problem, which is how do we optimize the workforce? How do we get each and every person to work as hard as possible for our society? And if everyone did that, then our society would be strong, united, and prosperous, right? Okay? So that's a fundamental problem of politics. How do you optimize workforce participation?